When I got my diagnosis, I said that it must be a mistake. Could they please test again? Because I really didn't think it would be something that would ever affect me.
Oftentimes when you hear about African people living with HIV, it's often the negative. We are portrayed as statistics, as recipients of services.
But I do remember, for me, a very important tipping point was when I decided to be open about my status, because at that point I realized that my invisibility was colluding with stigma.
Part of our purpose in life as people living with HIV, queer people, any marginalised people, is to tell our own stories, because the state, the establishment aren't going to do it.
Welcome to this special compilation episode featuring highlights from Series 1 and 2 of HIV The Morning After. It's here to keep the feed interesting before Series 3 drops next month. This is the fourth of 5 such episodes playing out across May. It is crucial when listening to testimony to get as varied a group of people as possible, to ensure that often silenced voices are given spaces to be heard. With that in mind, this episode is titled, Who Gets to Tell This Story? Susan Cole-Haley is a writer, broadcaster, Fellow of the Royal Society of Arts, and co-founder of the Phoenix Health Movement, as well as being a trailblazing advocate for the health needs of Black women in the UK. But in this episode, we roll back to 1999. Susan is living in rural Louisiana and is preparing to move there permanently. As part of this process, she must take an HIV test.
I rocked up for the results, and the doctor, the immigration doctor, who probably knew very little about HIV, said to me, "Well, the good news is you don't have syphilis." And I was like, yay, no syphilis. But the bad news is you're HIV positive. Before my HIV diagnosis, I'd asked my GP about getting an HIV test, and he said to me, "Oh no, dear, that doesn't affect ladies like you, and it could mean that you won't get like a mortgage or health insurance or anything like that." So even trying to explore getting information about HIV, I heard stigmatizing things. But when I told my father, one of the first things he said to me was, "Make sure you don't tell anyone about this." So it really brought home to me that this was quite a stigmatizing thing.
What does that feel like?
It didn't feel good. It made me feel quite ashamed. But my dad's passed away now, but I think that his motivation was really to protect me by not telling anyone. But I think, that stemmed from his experiences of hearing about HIV. He was living in Jamaica at the time, and there is so much stigma in the Caribbean. I had breast cancer about 12 years ago, and I remember the first time I met with an oncologist to discuss my treatment. One of the first things the doctor asked me was how I got HIV, how I wasn't passing it on to my HIV negative husband, and he also wrote HIV positive with a big circle around it when I went to get a blood test. I worked for NAM AIDS Map. Then I went to work for the UK Coalition of People Living with HIV, UKC, which was an absolute hoot. The vast majority of people working there were living with HIV themselves. And it was extraordinarily liberating for me to be with other people living shamelessly with HIV. I wrote for a magazine called Positive Nation. And when I was pregnant with my son, I did a naked cover of the magazine to show that women living with HIV could have children born free of HIV. And some people didn't actually like the fact that I did this naked cover. I was in 4-inch Gucci heels, reclining on sheepskin, heavily pregnant. They actually airbrushed out my cellulite for the magazine cover. So it did look good. And soon after the magazine came out, a woman got in touch with me and said that her doctor was trying to persuade her to have a termination because she had HIV. And when she saw the article, she realised that she didn't need to, and then she went on to have an HIV negative baby.
We heard from Kenya-born Angelina Namiba in the first of these special episodes. There, she talked about how little 1990s HIV education was aimed at black women, and how for her, volunteering and working gave her the power to keep going. Now Angelina is one of the UK's foremost African HIV advocates, and she co-authored a book called Our Stories Told by Us, celebrating the African contribution to the UK HIV response. But first, we're going to start back at that moment when Angelina received her diagnosis, because there is more of her story to share.
What made it even hard for me to face up to what could be was the fact that my own brother, who was also here studying at the North London Poly, he had also been diagnosed with HIV, but unfortunately, because it was the pre-treatment era, he was so ill the whole time. You know, he had all they call the indicator conditions. He had meningitis, he had Kaposi sarcoma, which is a form of cancer. He had epileptic fits, and he spent the last year of his life in between. I don't know if you've heard of the ward at Good Street. Gideon Mandel had done lots of photographs and written about it. So in between Good Street, which was an HIV specialist ward, and then in the London Lighthouse, and then he subsequently died in the Mildmay Hospice. So this is what I knew of HIV, and I thought I just couldn't face up to it. We, as people living with HIV, experience stigma in so many different ways, but one of it is the internalized stigma. So if you think about it, like for me, when I was diagnosed, all I knew about HIV was the negativity, was people getting ill, people dying. And so when you're diagnosed with HIV, you almost don't want to be associated with HIV. But also the stigma, the moralizing, the judgment that if to get HIV, you must have done something wrong. But actually, and it's until you meet other people living with HIV, for me anyway, that tell you actually, no, you should not buy into that judgment, the moral. I mean, HIV is a virus, not a moral issue. And there's still women today who are not accessing services. In fact, when I worked at Positively Women, because we had a helpline and we had support groups, there's some women who'd call the helpline, and I supported them for years, but never saw them because they couldn't physically come into the organization.
Do you think that was because the internalized shame was so strong that they couldn't even bring themselves to be in a space with other HIV positive women who were in exactly the same situation as them?
Yeah, so there's the shame, but then there's the fear as well. So there's a lot of this, not just the shame. And a lot of the shame is what people foster onto you. I mean, I have to say, in the early days when I was open about my status, and I remember I would do interviews with the media, and the journalists would always ask me, how did you get HIV? And I used to get really angry, and many of us get upset about that because why is that so key to you? And we realized that earlier on that they ask us that almost so that they can place us into a box of, yeah, she did something wrong. So then I stopped being angry. And the next time a journalist asked me, so how did you get HIV? And I said to him, well, how I got HIV is, getting HIV is not because of what I did, right? It's because of what I didn't do. And what I didn't do was what millions of other young women, young people my age are not doing. I didn't use a condom. From the time, HIV was, shall I say, came to be in the UK like 40 or so years ago, you never really hear the positive stories of African people. So what we wanted to do was to celebrate our contribution, to amplify our leadership, just to show that we've also been here equally, responding to the response, if that makes sense, alongside other, healthcare providers, clinicians, researchers. So we put together this book called Our Stories Told by Us, celebrating the African contribution to the UK HIV response, which does exactly what it says on the tin. But we also wanted to tell our stories in our own words, in our own way, because if we didn't do that, somebody else was going to do it in their own words.
Today, Sylvia Petretti runs Positively UK as chief executive, but we join her in this episode in her home country of Italy 30 years earlier. She has just left a hospital in Rome where she has tested positive.
The thing that I felt immediately was an incredible fear and shame. I didn't tell anyone. I went home and I just, cried for weeks on end. I got very, very faint memories of the maybe first 6 months. I think the trauma and the shock were so strong, and I didn't have anyone to talk to. And I just felt like I felt very scared to share my status, scared of the judgment, scared of, of people, maybe avoiding me or rejecting me. And as well, everything around you in society is telling you that somehow this is your fault and that what you have is shameful and almost, it makes you unlovable, untouchable. And that's how it felt. You feel like your own body was toxic and you were hosting the enemy inside. And it is very, very dark place to be.
When you are frightened and when you feel this pressure to then be untouchable on that and feel that you cannot have even the touch of comfort, the touch of someone's arms around you, that must compound the problem hugely.
Yeah, it was really hard. And especially I remember at that time, and most of my girlfriends, which I hadn't told my status yet, were getting married and having children and planning their lives and their future. And I felt completely alienated. Like, I was planning my funeral. But I do remember, for me, a very important tipping point was when I decided to be open about my status. And that was around 2004, 2005. Because at that point, I realized that my invisibility was colluding with stigma. The fact that there were not many women who were visible living with HIV. If we wanted to overcome stigma, we needed to be visible and heard. And so I decided not to, to speak with the media, to have my pictures taken, to be on the front of a Positively Women magazine. I did this sculpture with artist Mark Quinn that portrayed my body. It was a custom-made body with antiretrovirals and was exposed at the Wellcome Trust for a few years. It was just there at the entrance. But it was like this idea that in order for stigma to end, people living with HIV, women living with HIV, we need to be visible and we need to be heard, and nobody's going to do it for us. Nobody's going to give you the space. You need to step up and take it.
Today, Dan Glass is an activist and author and co-founder of ACT UP London. But we join them in Brighton when they're in their early 20s, the moment that they test positive. At that time, the only representation of HIV that they could think of was Mark Fowler. Mark was a character from the BBC soap opera EastEnders. We joined Dan on their first thoughts on testing positive and what it meant to them.
Death. It just meant death and isolation and internalized stigma, and that it's your own fault. And it was just savage. And when you mentioned Mark Fowler, I still love you, Todd Carty. You actually were such a salvation for me, even though it was really miserable seeing you get on your motorbike and leave the square on your own. That was my only frame of reference. It was deeply lonely. It was deeply scary. And I just didn't have a Danny LaRue about what it actually meant, let alone on a scientific level. I just knew that it meant death, really, because that was at the height of the crisis, really, the 80s and 90s. I didn't have any friends. I didn't know any friends who were HIV positive, and at really that time, any queer friends either. So I didn't really have any kind of ropes to hang on to.
I was obviously aware of ACT UP so I'm born in 73, and I knew of ACT UP through a lot of the films I was watching in the 90s, even things like Zero Patience. ACT UP are a big part of that and feature in that, and I've always believed that direct action is very much needed alongside sort of suits and nice dinners and polite conversation and looking at things like Outrage, the amazing direct action that they did and their knowledge. And I think ACT UP very much have this as well, that knowledge that you need the wow moment.
Yeah.
And now it seems obvious. Now we know that you need the single photograph image that represents it all. But people like ACT UP and people like Outrage realized that years ago. I would imagine it must be an incredibly intimidating thing to reform such a fantastic organization. But actually, it sounds like for you, it wasn't. It sounds like it was just a natural step of something that had to happen.
Yeah, I think, seeing the footage of the meetings in the LGBT Centre in New York, of the fierceness, the vibrancy, the urgency, the joy, the cruising, because I have such a deep need for reconnection because of, as we've talked about, Section 28, let alone my biological ancestry of like complete obliteration because of the Nazi Holocaust. I have a real deep need for community, rebuilding community, as so many of us do. I remember actually the second meeting, there was 4 of us, and there was 2 younger guys there who must have been around 25, and 2 older guys who were coming back to ACT UP. And it was really interesting facilitating that meeting. The 2 younger guys were dealing with chemsex, one of them chemsex, and one of them with early diagnosis, and were dealing with their own traumas. And one of the older guys said, listen, I don't know what you younger generation have got to deal with. We lost all of our friends. And I was like, hang on a second. This is not the Oppression Olympics. It's not a competition of how much trauma we've dealt with. Let's stop and listen to each other's realities, because we're all part of the same reality, the same symptom of institutional marginalization and oppression against us all. And for me, facilitating intergenerational conversations, how we can learn from each other and learn about our connections and our similarities so that we can move forward in unity is fundamental. Part of our purpose in life as people living with HIV, queer people, any marginalised people, is to tell our own stories, because the state, the establishment aren't going to do it. And I think the main things that were missing was really, when you zoom out, the brilliance of our community, because we weren't told about the actual true human stories of everyone who should be here, who isn't. And every single person has a huge wealth of creativity, of characteristics, a whole personality, not just a statistic. And really all it was statistics. the main thread that I see throughout my spark, which has sparked me to become active and activist, is challenging silence. And that's why the pink triangle, silence equals death, is at my core. Challenging silence and stigma is everything.
Full conversations with Susan Cole-Haley, Angelina Namiba, Sylvia Petretti, and Dan Glass are available now on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and wherever you normally listen to podcasts. Thank you to Paulie Nidu at UnstoppableMonsters.com for his wonderful theme tune, and to Murray Lang for his continued support. Please rate and review the show as it helps to spread the word. Series 3 of HIV The Morning After begins in June. I've been Dan Hall.